Yes, well, I think I might go ahead and get started just because I want to make sure Dr. Lamont has as much time as possible to share all the wonderful work she's been doing. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. Dr. Michèle Lamont is Professor of Sociology and of African American Studies and the Robert Goldman Professor of European Studies at Harvard. She's also director of Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow for 2019 to 2021. So I guess she never sleeps. Dr. Lamont has authored and co-authored many books, published extensively on a range of topics, including culture and inequality, racism and stigma, academia and knowledge, social change and successful societies. She has been president of the American Sociological Association. She chaired the Council for European Studies, and has received all kinds of awards, too numerous to name. She is currently working on a book on social change and repertoires of hope, which seems exceedingly timely in the current moment, which will be published by Simon & Schuster and Penguin. So we are really thrilled to have her with us today to talk about some of the work that she's doing on resilience, change, and hope. So welcome, Dr. Lamont, and I'm going to hand it over to you. And what I'll say to everyone, sorry, I didn't mean it. If people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And then when Dr. Lamont has finished her presentation, I'll moderate the discussion and take the questions out of the chat.
Well, thank you so much, Laura and Vish, for this invitation. I'm really thrilled to be speaking to your group, in part because you will see you are the experts of two of the, the subjective well-being is at the center of my talk, as is communication. So I'm hitting on both of your respective strengths. I will share my screen. You have it there, you see it? Yes. Yes. Okay, so I will be talking to you about a book that I'm in the process of writing. So this is just, hot, not even out of the oven yet. It's still in the oven, and it's a book that I started working on 2 years ago, but that has become even more urgent with the pandemic and the current crisis, the broader crisis that we're facing now, the crisis that has manifested itself in part through a Black Lives Matter movement last summer. So what is at the center of my preoccupations is the question of broadening cultural membership, of recognition of groups that have been historically stigmatized that are now claiming their place in society. And this broadening of worth of cultural membership is what I address through this concept of recognition. So the person with blonde hair there is Zachary Drucker, who is someone who has advised the producers of the show Transparent about how to depict the life of a queer man who around 60 years old decides that he wants to live as a queer person and negotiates the relationship with his grown-up children. So it's a show that has been partly important in helping, middle-class, normal Americans to understand what the life of a queer person is, to humanize him, to present him in a three-dimensional way. So I interviewed this person in the context of my book. And you see the t-shirt that says, I see you. Well, that's very central to some of the values that are part of this process of recognition that is gaining more and more visibility. And that manifests itself also to the Black Lives Matter. Groups that have been invisible, groups that have suffered from social and racial justice are making claims. And we will return to the kindness is everything as part of politics where the personal is political. So this builds on the book that I co-published in 2013, which brought together the work of the Successful Society program of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which I directed for 17 years. And we approach resilience by focusing not on the individual qualities that make people resilient, but on how societies can support resilience by creating institutions and promoting cultural repertoires that sustain people's resilience, by giving them support, by recognizing their identity. So one example is the direct impact of the same-sex marriage law on the decline in number of suicide among LGBTQ youth. So we'll come back to other examples. And at the end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about the social resilience of Gen Zs, whom we have interviewed for this project. So the project is based on mostly two sets of interviews, one with agents of change or cultural producers who seed cultural representation, messages, frames through society that are promoting inclusion and recognition. I did 160 such interviews. Some of them were conducted by my research assistant. And we also interviewed 80 college students, Gen Zs, mostly middle class, half of them people of color, half of them white in the Midwest and Northeast. They were interviewed before the pandemic in the fall of 2019 and again last summer. And that's the data I'm going to talk about today. So the key concept is this concept of recognition, which, drawing on the German philosopher Accelerateu, is defined as social act by which the positive social worth of individuals are affirmed and acknowledged. And this is the counter concept is stigmatization, which you'll probably all be very familiar with. The work of Goldman in particular focuses on this as the process by which people are qualified negatively. So you're very familiar with the, in the literature you guys operate with. The work of David Williams is, for instance, very much concerned with this. And the broader process that I'm concerned with is the process of broadening cultural membership. And this has to do with how social actors understand themselves as similar and different from one another, which comes with obligations, for instance, for support, for welfare support in particular, for solidarity. And I understand this broadening of cultural membership and stigmatization and recognition as cultural processes that are unfolding through everyday life, through micro-act, and that involves intersubjective definitions of reality. And I've written more broadly on cultural processes and how they feed into inequality. So that's for the theoretical part of the talk. And I argue that it matters. For instance, the impact of racism on health outcomes that is studied in the Harvard School of Public Health. How, for instance, LGBTQ youth who are thrown out of the house by parents who don't accept their sexual orientation has a direct effect on their poverty. So it's not that material resources always trump stigmatization or recognition. The relationship is far more complex. It can be two ways, and that's one reason why we really need to study recognition. When I was president of the ASA, I presented a paper titled, my presidential lecture was titled Addressing the Recognition Gap. And that's what I draw on, as well as this paper From Having to Being, which came out in the British Journal of Sociology. And I've published a series of papers that all feed into this project, in particular this paper, Destigmatization and Health, which came out in the Social Science and Medicine, which would interest you particularly. So the book is structured in two parts. The first part is a diagnosis, and the second part offers solution, but properly cultural solution. Since I'm a cultural sociologist, there's a lot of other solution having to do with the distribution of resources, but I'm interested in the production of narratives that would help people cope with the crisis that we are encountering. There's many ways of defining this crisis, but the aspect of the crisis that I'm most concerned with is the cultural aspect. So it comes with neoliberalism, this set of social transformation that have to do with market fundamentalism, making the market the driving force, increasingly the unique driving force of social organization. And if we look at the diffusion of this concept in the media, we see that 2016 was a recent peak. So, and that's true in Europe as much as in the US. So it's shaping our lives in great many ways at the level of economics, politics, administration. But the aspect that I'm most concerned with is the script of self, which are the broad shared cultural frameworks through which we define what is an ideal self, what kind of self we should all be embodying as human beings. And the script of self that has become hegemonic with neoliberalism has to do with our capacity to maximize our wealth, to be professionally successful, to consume, to gain status. and also to demonstrate self-reliance, the privatization of risk, which means that we don't depend on the state to take care of ourselves. We have to be competitive and function as hyper-competent agents in the market. This comes hand in hand with a celebration of meritocracy, where the achievement of the individuals are viewed as indebted only to individual effort and not to the resources that society gives them. And this meritocratic cultural repertoire has gained popularity across a great many advanced industrial societies. In particular, this is the data between over the last, from 1930 to 2010, and you can see that it has increased in a number of countries. The United States is where it is most popular. So this study by Jonathan Misch that I'm talking about here concerns 23 advanced industrial society, and he found that it has increased in all but 5 of these countries. So it's a very significant transformation that celebrates individual achievement and conceives the individual independently of what society gives them. But this is happening in the context of an American society where the likelihood of upward mobility is decreasing very significantly. Many Americans continue to believe that the American dream exists, but it has been watered down. It means everything. It means having a good family. People think that it's attainable by themselves, but not by others. And it is most popular for immigrants and people who are not college educated. It has become identified with what it means to be an American citizen, believing in the American dream. So when people tell us they believe in the American dream, it doesn't mean anything. And also it has become so widely spread, but the reality of it, the capacity for people to be upwardly mobile is not, a reality anymore. So the question then is, what are the effect of this dream? Well, I argue that it has become quite dysfunctional. It celebrates the upper middle class as embodying all these qualities, the scripts of self that I described earlier, but it also frames the working class as less self-reliant, as stigmatized because don't meet the criteria of success. It creates a cultural polarization, which has been associated with the election of Trump, since Trump has been very good at celebrating the achievement of the working man. I can talk about this in the Q&A if you want. At the same time, the upper middle class is presented to everyone as the model that they should follow, even if they don't have the means or the financials support needed to do so. And this is partly visible in a content analysis of a television program, which constantly shows the upper middle class as competent and the working class. Think about Barb Simpson, for instance, as clowns, immature, incompetent. So it's very difficult for the working class to see images of themselves that are valorizing. At the same time as this model is diffusing, there's data. I'm sure you guys, since you're all expert, will know data that contradicts what I'm presenting here, but it seems that there's been a significant increase in depression, even among the people who should be the winners of the system, non-Hispanic whites. And surveys, such as the one I mentioned in the first line, mention money and work as the most common reasons for stress. So there's an increase in depression, an increase in stress, which correlates with, decline in subjective well-being over the last few years. And this is also true in particular among young people. The UCLA freshman studies, for instance, shows an increase in the number of people who feel overwhelmed. And we know we experience this directly among our students, both graduate and undergraduate students at Harvard. The level of preoccupation with mental health has increased exponentially over the last few years. So, in fact, in the face of this very pessimistic diagnostic, we have to ask ourselves how to move forward. So, one possible solution is to have a close look at what are the alternative cultural narratives that are being produced and which can feed how people think about how to move forward, the sources of hope. At a time of enormous uncertainty, especially since the start of the pandemic, it's been extremely difficult. particularly for young people, partly for the people who are single, those whose life was very much in a process of transition to understand what is ahead. So they're grasping for models about how to move forward. So I analyze these alternative cultural narratives, alternative to the American dream, by focusing on cultural producers. And I ask myself, who are the people who produce these alternative narratives? And in what ways are the alternative narratives promoting different ways of thinking about worth? In particular, are they promoting pluralistic criteria of worth so that not only people who are economically successful would be viewed as worthy of admiration? Do we move from a unidimensional hierarchy to a multidimensional hierarchy? Are people promoting what I call everyday cosmopolitanism, which has to do with the notion that we're all worthy? We could be all worthy because we're all the children of God, or because we're all human beings, or as a matter of political principles. So there's a great many reasons why people might promote everyday cosmopolitanism, but I focus on this in particular. And finally, I also ask myself, how are groups becoming destigmatized if this is happening? So the focus is on the public sphere. And of course, when we talk about public sphere, people always take as a point of departure the work of Habermas, but the public sphere has changed enormously over the last few years with the explosion in activity and various platforms, digital in particular. So I draw on the work of these colleagues who have done a lot in terms of providing new models for conceptualizing the public sphere today, which makes room for these phenomenon of, new media, professionalization of social movements, the emergence of hybrid institutions. So one could schematically conceptualize the public sphere as something like this. So I have found respondents from these various realms of life and interviewed them on the work that they do and what are the cultural messages that they try to convey as they do the work. So I'll just present to you a few of the respondents. So it ranges from people in academia, such as our colleague Henry Louis Gates, who has played a very profound role in revolutionizing the literary canon. Sister Barbara Stanley, who is the Mother Superior of the Missionary Sisters of Sacred Heart. There's only 250 of them alive, but they control an enormous fortune with which they do a lot in terms of promoting various values. So you have stand-up comics, you have poets, I'm going to talk about them in a few minutes, and artists. So in various fields of policy, incarceration, labor, for instance, Agent Pooh, who's one of the leaders for the Fight for 15 that has been very much in the news recently. And around social movement, whether Me Too or the Women's March or community organizing, climate justice, social policy, Heather Boucher, who's now on the Council of Economic Advisors of Biden, and the Socialist Renewal, which was, of course, behind the success of Bernie Sanders. And finally, a number of people. We have a total of 70 people who are in Hollywood and a stand-up comic, which is a kind of parallel study of the project. So to illustrate to you what this is about, I'll talk to you a little bit about the photographers. I've interviewed a number of African-American and queer photographers about what they try to do with the medium with which they work. And when I talk to them about their work, they emphasize the ways in which they are working with populations that have been historically dehumanized or stereotyped, and they are trying to provide three-dimensional depictions of these groups to represent them as they would like to be represented, which means to humanize them, to dignify them, also to make them visible, to put them out of the closet. So it's a work of recognition. The terms they use very much has to do with increasing the value, the scripts, the frames through which, the lenses through which we perceive these groups that have been historically stigmatized, and to give them a more positive frame. So for instance, Catherine Opie, who is part of the leather community in Los Angeles, says of this community that they're often represented as child molesters. And she says, instead of showing the tattoos and the piercings and the marking on the body, I wanted to do a series of portraits of this community that were incredibly noble. So, and she talks about presenting them the way they would like to be seen and conveying the affection that people have of each other, even if they are sadomasochist. So another example is the work of Hank Willis Thomas, who has used videos to interview 150 African-American men across the country, asking all of them this question: what does it mean to you to be a Black man? And what you discover by watching this video is that there's huge diversity among them, and that most of what they are in common is the prejudgment that people place upon this group. So the diversity of what it means to be a Black man becomes visible through watching the video. And it's been, this video has been extremely widely circulated to museums and schools. It has been used for community engagement to stimulate conversation around the stereotypes that accompany Black men. So if you want to see this video, you can simply Google question bridge and you will see it. It's really remarkable and very, very powerful. So this is a case where this artwork has been scaled up and has been really used to transform perceptions. There's a real purpose of social intervention here. And this is made possible by an organization called Campaign for Black Male Achievement that is headed by Shawn. And I interviewed Shawn, and he told me the story of his organization, which was started with support of the Open Society Foundation, but has grown a lot since. And Dove, like many of the people I interviewed, is very much focused on the transformation of language and narratives in storytelling as a tool for social transformation. The awareness of the ways in which the language that people use to, for instance, talk about the poor has grown enormously. The Gates Foundation has invested a fortune on narrative change, and the Ford Foundation has been a very important leader in promoting this focus on changing hearts and minds as a tool for social change. So when I talked to him about his organization, he says, well, Black men and boys have always been identified first by their problem and what's wrong with them, with Black people being the face of poverty and the face of crime. Instead, we want to emphasize their aspiration. So he very purposefully is using the very considerable resources that he controls to facilitate this shift, and supporting the work of Hank Willis Williams is one of the ways that he has been able to do this. So what we see is what I call recognition chains, collaboration between funders and cultural producers in order to not only produce new cultural messages, new cultural repertoires, but also that these cultural repertoire are promoting recognitions of stigmatized group. But the funders, or it can be universities, it's a very wide range of organizations, are there to scale up the message and ensure that it contributes to producing social change. And of course, that has become even more salient since last summer, following the massive movement for racial justice that we witnessed. Several of the largest foundations in the United States have committed to making social and racial justice their focus for the next few years. And we've seen a process of elite cohort replacement at the top of several cultural industries. So for instance, the Poetry Foundation, which is in Chicago, saw a putsch where the former president of Northwestern University, a white man in his 70s who had been the president, was kicked out and replaced by a putsch by younger poets of color. So there's really a process, and there's been turnovers in many of the main publishing houses in academia, in a number of industries. There's a cultural sectors. There's a great concern about the promotion of social and racial justice, which is facilitated by this focus on the desire to repair injustices from the past. So the exchange that I'm talking about, you can also look at it through the process by which groups are being destigmatized. So I'll mention briefly this paper that I co-authored with students a few years ago, where we compare the process of destigmatization of people with HIV/AIDS with two groups that have been far less successful, African Americans and people labeled as obese. And we do this by using a secondary literature that traces the process or the efforts of destigmatization of these groups. So in particular for people labeled as obese, we look at the book by Abigail Sagi, What's Wrong with Fat, where she looks at the social movements and others who have been involved and why have they succeeded and why they have not succeeded. So in general, when we look at these three cases, we find a number of experts, knowledge producers. You guys would be very central in this story, that have lended their expertise to show, for instance, that people who get HIV/AIDS, anyone can get it. It's not only gay men who might be too promiscuous. So there's a lowering of the moral stigma accompanying this health challenge, and you have massive coverage by journalists. So we draw on the book by Steve Epstein on the HIV/AIDS crisis to show how this happened. And then there's a collaboration between activists. And all of this, which was very well developed in the case of HIV/AIDS, does not happen at all to the same degree for obesity, although it is changing right now, you will see. And for African American, the case is mixed. So we come up with a model such as this one, which shows how culture, which is related to the social resilience book I started with, which emphasizes how the cultural resources on which social actors draw are then mobilized to engage in destigmatizing action, which results in destigmatizing outcomes. So it's a cultural process that is agent-based, and the social actors are knowledge producers, people like us, experts, but also social movements and members of the group themselves, ordinary people. So the destigmatization of obesity over the last 2-3 years, as now, you know, you have a number of people like Lizzo or like Megan Thee Stallion, who are hefty African-American women who are celebrating their bodies and who are constantly talking about body acceptance. So which resulted, for instance, at the 2020 Grammys with Lizzo singing, being surrounded by 20 very large ballet dancers. So the paradox and the series Bridgerton that is now being shown, where a lot of these the characters who are 18th century British aristocrats, you have Black people playing these roles. So the person who is realizing this show, Shonda Rhimes, is very central to Netflix, and she has been promoting making race, more part of, promoting the greater presence of African-American actors, but also what she's doing in engineering representation of reality of this sort is very powerful, because it makes people aware of their own assumptions about who should be playing what. So for the next few minutes, I will return to the topic of social resilience and talk to you about the part of the project that is concerned with Gen Zs. At the same time as I'm writing this book, I've been co-authoring with 2 graduate students 2 different papers. One of them focuses specifically on social resilience, and another one focuses on the cultural repertoires that Gen Zs are drawing on to make sense of their lives as they are in this liminal period where it's so difficult for them to project themselves into the future. And I know because I have 3 Gen Zs in my family, and I was able to experience one. I have twins who were freshmen last year, and the openness, do I go back? Do I take a gap year? We have experienced this up close. So why study Gen Zs? Well, this is a group that has gained in prominence over the last few years, as you can see here by this graph showing the frequency of mentions in the media. Millennials, of course, are also very much covered. The Gen Zs typically are defined as people who are born after 98, and basically the population we looked at, we interviewed college students born between 98 and 2002. So and this is a group that is viewed as facing great uncertainty. You have tons of articles showing also that they are facing an aggravated mental health crisis in the context of COVID, that their position in the labor market are the weakest of all, in part because they don't have work experience. So it's very difficult for them to find jobs. So they are really being hit by the pandemic in many, many ways. And that's true also of the millennial, but not up to the same extent. And there's a lot that has been written already about them. They're concerned with the environment, so fewer of them want children. They call themselves doomers. They are quite politically engaged. They're very critical of the boomers. I'm a boomer. And they think that the boomers have lived in a period of abundance and haven't done anything with it. They're also a little bit skeptical of institutions. So they like local action, local politics. They want to stay, they think that national media like the New York Times are, corrupt. So they really want to customize the ways in which they get their information. And they want to live an ethical life that is based on authenticity. So we wanted through our interviews to explore more deeply what it is that they want and how do they understand the future as they're going through this very challenging period, and also at the time when they were deeply involved in politics over the last year, being a major force behind Bernie Sanders. So the first paper has to do with how they are dealing with how do they understand their own social resilience? What are the tools to which they turn to make sense of their situation, and what resources they think they can mobilize as they are facing such an uncertain future. So we look at the cultural resources that they mobilize, that are made available to them by the agents of change that we study. So we ask them who's an inspiration for you. So they talk about performers, they talk about writers, they talk about stand-up comics. And we are able to document in our study that there's two types of scripts of self that dominate in the group, what we call autonomous and collective scripts of self. And the collective orientation is becoming far more prevalent. And it is here you can see the verbs that we have associated with 3 dimensions of this collective self that they talk about: collective identity, adaptation, and future orientation. When we ask them, what tools do you have at your disposal to face the uncertainty of the moment? They talk about connecting to others, engaging in destigmatization, fostering inclusion. So this essentially has to do with fostering recognition, but also investing the future, being able to imagine alternatives. So the approach to social resilience that we end up adopting in this paper is one that focuses on subjective definition of self-reliance, how they understand the sources of their own self-reliance. So we don't have any measures, but we have accounts. And we show that they think about this as a process, which is why you have all these verbs in ing, which shows that it is ongoing, and that they think of these actions as things that they can do on an ongoing basis as they lead their life, drawing on the resources that are made available to them. And I have a few illustrations of what these orientations are about. For instance, the first quote, it's about we don't all have to play golf on Sunday or go to a Christian church. We all have diverse background, diverse interests, diverse freedom. So it's really about celebrating our plurality of paths and, celebrating your passions, which is what is emphasized in the second quote. So this has to do with authenticity and, diversity. And also the focus on morality as a tool for everyday cosmopolitanism and equalization principle. So everyone is worthy. And you see the focus on niceness here. Well, the idea that we want to foster a society that is less hierarchical, where we should be kinder to each other, is a very central theme in how they talk about the society they want to live in, what is worth fighting for in their view. And the obligation of being involved in collective mobilization. So you can see the last quote, how dare you not have an opinion? We have no choice. We have only one planet. We have to live in it together. These are themes that are very much, recurrent. So here you have the summary concerning the conditions of social resilience that this paper presents. So I'm particularly eager to get your input on this. I'm sorry I cannot describe it in greater details. So so you have a personal orient, and when we compare the interviews we did before and after and during COVID, what we've seen is a growing emphasis put on collective orientation, the obligation to do my part, to focus on activism and collective well-being. So they want a society that is more collectively oriented. One objection could be, well, that's always been the case for the 18 to 22-year-old, but there are studies conducted in the 2000s by Chris Smith, for instance, and he does not find the same level of commitment that we find. And also this generation is coming of age at the time when all organizations are promoting diversity programs. So the meaning of diversity is quite different from them than it was for the previous generation. And the second paper is about the braiding of cultural repertoires. So what are the sources of their repertoires that are influencing their worldview? And while one might want to say, oh, they're just still neoliberal, engaged in professional project. In fact, when we interviewed them and tried to trace which cultural repertoires they draw on in making sense of their lives, we find that they're able to braid several repertoires that are often described as mutually exclusive. So they still put a lot of emphasis on hard work and on being entrepreneurial, which is why we have American dream and neoliberalism here. But they also believe that we have to lead a balanced life where we pay attention to our mental health. So the therapeutic ethic is very central to them. They are constantly talking about well-being. It's very much, it seems like they all have therapists and that's being spoon-fed to them. The theme of ordinary cosmopolitanism, the notion that we have to have an inclusive society, that we're all equal, is very important. And the Gen Z cohort narrative has to do with how they define themselves in opposition to us, the boomers, and how they view themselves as a group that is actively engaged toward producing a more inclusive society. So here you can see what are the elements of these various repertoires that they mention as they are describing their current life and what they think is ahead, and what are the tools that they have at their disposal to negotiate the future, and which are the elements that they are rejecting. So if you look on their American dream, they are rejecting socioeconomic inequality, they're rejecting social diversity, i.e. poverty. They want societies that are more economically equal, and they are very critical of downward mobility, the cost of college, even college admission. And at the end, what we find is that they're able to braid elements from various repertoires, bringing them together with a recognition of the plurality of life path and this focus on moral character and communal participation that I've already talked about. But this is among college educated students, so college students. So we don't know what would happen in a sample made mostly of working class students. We have 13 working class students in our sample, and what we find in general is that they feel that first they have to help their family to, you know, bring home some resources, some money, and that they say, I will contribute to society's broader goals after I have completed these objectives. So they're also pursuing professional projects that are more oriented toward short-term profit and that are in some ways less idealistic. So one question is, of course, that if the middle class students are defining the new ideal self around such values, are they at the same time drawing boundaries against working class students who don't necessarily have the means to carry the same agenda? So this is what this slide is about, that there might be very explicit exclusion toward those who don't share their political values. So they acknowledge the dangers of cancel culture, but also implicit exclusion toward those who don't have access to the same resources and have to focus on their shorter term material interest. So in conclusion, I think we can think about this project as contributing to our understanding of the process by which we're now developing a national culture oriented toward diversity at the time when people of color as a category will feed into a majority society very soon. There's a number of sociologists who are looking at different aspects of these cultural transformation. And we think of this study as feeding that, but at the more practical level, we hope that it helps us understand how people can develop social resilience in these uncertain times. I know I was very rapid here and you don't have full understanding of what we try to do, but we can discuss it in the Q&A. And these are the students who have been working with me on this project, and they're a wonderful group. I thank them. And I thank you, and I look forward to your feedback, especially since, as I said, this is very much in the making, and I will certainly benefit a lot from your own expertise in those topics. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. A lot.
Yes.
That is so fascinating. So I'm going to open it up to group for questions. You can put your questions in the chat. If anyone wants to have a question, I'll start with a question while people are maybe, oh, I see actually Vish has his hand up too. All right, well, I'll start with my question, then we'll go to Vish. I was just curious, you said you identified a couple of key ingredients, and I was writing, I'm not sure I got them all exactly right, of what are social resilience. And through, I think through the interviews and through some of the other work you were doing. And I was just wondering, do you have a benchmark to say that that is, you know, who is socially resilient or which groups are socially resilient, or is that coming out of, you know, the interviews where you look at, like, I was just wondering, how do you know that those are?
Yeah. Well, we're drawing, I mean, we have data at only one point in time, and we don't have any indicators that are objective. So there's a literature on subjective resilience, the work of Catherine Panther-Briggs. There's a guy at University of Montreal, also Bourbeau, who we're drawing on. So it's a narrative approach to social resilience. And what I've seen in the literature is that it seems like there's a movement toward a more like multi-method approach to resilience, acknowledging that, okay, measurements of, you know, objective indicators gives you one picture, but a complementary picture can be produced with subjective description. So their experience is worthwhile, and that's what they think gives them, you know, they're asking, what are the resources I need to be able to project myself into the future? Mm-hmm. And they talk also about their past experience that may have prepared them, and the ways in which, talking of cultural repertoire, these past experiences have fed their understanding of what resilience is about, which are resources that they can draw on as they project themselves into the future. So I know it's limited, but that's the data we have.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, I was thinking you could probably quantify it in some ways. You could look at areas that have more or less of these kind of at an aggregate level and see if there's better health, right? In the areas, in the way we do lots of this kind of, you know, multi-level analysis and stuff. So I think it would be Interesting.
So you would use what, like questionnaires or?
Yeah, you could take use surveys and then aggregate by counties or
yeah.
whatever, and see if states or counties that have higher levels of some of these
Yeah.
that people are sharing, you know, and end up looking better.
Yeah.
All kinds of like mortality or, you know,
Yeah.
rates of depression or something. So I think it's really interesting.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
There could be confounding factors, but
many, right. We deal with that a lot. We're good. Yeah. All right, Vish, did you have a question?
Sure. So thank you, Michelle. That's absolutely fascinating. I look forward to the book and reading the book. You know, it was a great talk. So forgive me if I don't have my thoughts completely clear, and if I'm getting it wrong, forgive me. So I was thinking about the current convulsion in our society we are experiencing right now. And so if recognition promotes sense of agency, collective efficacy, well-being, and that's what a number of these groups are striving for, it looks like, and some of them are more successful than others. Is recognition perceived as a zero-sum game? The reason I'm asking is so every time, so we have a Black Lives Matter movement that seems to be getting some recognition. There is a group of, the stereotype is working class whites who are against it. So one group is getting validated and recognized, but then I am losing my social power, is what some groups are feeling. So is that a problem, and is that a valid hypothesis?
Yeah, I think it is, but there's also counter hypotheses such as we know that contact makes a big difference, physical proximity. So one of our graduate students, for instance, has shown that if in college people share a room, have a roommate from a different social class, it leads people to have a much better understanding of what are the challenges of people from different classes, but also of different race, so that you can counter the stereotypes and the sense of displacement that comes from not having enough contact by fostering interaction. So one of the basic social mechanisms or dynamics is this theory of Herbert Blumer that people have a sense of group positioning, so that men want to be above women, white people, but this is not, what categories are operating there is not the same across all societies. And we see, for instance, that the degree of inequality between men and women has declined enormously over the 20th century. So this is not like these things are immutable. And now, of course, as we know from, you know, all the families with two parents who are making money, that this is not zero sum, that these can be complementary. So the question of how you can also engineer discourse to show we all win. And there's actually the leader of an important philanthropy that where I did interviews, Color of Change, who just came up with a book which is demonstrating how financially it's not zero sum, you know, that her name is Patricia. She's on the bestseller list of the New York Times right now. So, you know, there's a lot of cultural work that can be done to demonstrate that it doesn't have to be a zero sum. And I'm defining my argument in part in contrast to that of psychologists who are promoting this notion of tribalism. We know historically that the permeability of group boundaries is highly changeable. It's not a question of human values. Okay, there might be a competition in the context of scarce resources, but where and how and with what depth are group ready to be generous varies historically enormously. So, you know.
Just 1 second, Lara, if I can follow that up. Just to wonder, but if I don't share the same cultural reality, my repertoire, because of social, especially with social media, my repertoires are very different from yours.
Yeah.
And is there any hope for us? Or,
yeah. Well, of course, the literature on the political polarization that has been fed by the social media in the US is a huge problem. On the other hand, once people become more aware of it, for instance, the film, what is it, The Social Dilemma, the documentary, I think has really raised consciousness. I know one of my kids, started using a flip phone after that. So helping people understand the manipulation. And one part of my book is about this industry of narrative production. And most people don't know it exists. So my book is also going to talk about the professionalization of this sector, to say, yes, now, the production of narratives is part of the battle, and you have to be aware of the ways in which you're being influenced by it, with many companies such as Purpose, Swayable, that are all oriented toward producing the messages that will get you to do what they want you to do, What do you think, Vish? Do you think it's hopeless?
No, I can't survive if I am so hopeless. So
yeah,
for my own benefit, I do think this notion of bridge building across cultural repertoires is important. So the question is, who is doing it? I mean, Trump has done it very successfully in some ways, unfortunately, right? At least among, if you look at the anti-vaccine forces in the recent times, many different sets of groups who never worked with each other or coalesced with each other, came together. Groups, conspiracy theories separate from anti-vaccine groups. So he has been successful, unfortunately, in building that kind of a coalition and bridging those cultural repertoires. So the question is, we have to figure out how to counter that. And certainly the industry of narratives is very critical, with the Social Dilemma or whoever it is, whoever is creating those narratives. And so we have to figure that out, how to do it, how to counter it successfully.
And isn't there, like right now, the mobilization of hip hop artists to try to promote these messages to communities of color? And
that's absolutely correct. The question is, are they transcending those boundaries where these appeal to other groups?
Yes.
So, globally, for example, one of the most fascinating things about Black Lives Matter is you have people globally protesting these issues, right? I mean, that's incredible. People's experiences of Blacks here are completely different from in other countries. So the question is, how did that happen? We need to figure that out to understand.
Exactly. I know that in the French context, maybe some of you don't know, but the French ideology of republicanism is that religion and ethnicity don't matter. The citizens are entering in contact with the state independently of their phenotype, of their religion, while in fact we know that there's an enormous amount of racism against Muslim in France, but that's being denied by the state because they reject the American, balkanization of society around identity politics. Well, there's been massive protest inspired by Black Lives Matter. Now, people of color in France are much more readily, protesting against racism than they were a year ago, and it's been building very clearly. So that's a huge change. So the transnational movement of these repertoires is extremely powerful. As was
I'm just gonna jump in. We have a number of questions. I don't know that we'll have time for more than one more, but just to make sure we get at least one more in.
Sure.
Could go for. Clearly, we didn't schedule enough time, but I have a question here. How would you help the Asian Americans to overcome their long-standing discrimination in the U.S., given most Asians have been brought up either by the philosophies of Confucius or the Buddha?
Well, I think a lot of this happens through a socialization with peers in high school. We know that many Asian Americans go to school in neighborhoods where their group is not necessarily the majority group. So if you think of, I know it's the case at least in the middle class and upper middle class high schools where they're constantly interacting with people of other ethnic groups. So there's a lot of peer socialization, I think, that would counter parental socialization. You have this myth of the model immigrant incarnated by Asians, but at the same time, as they are experiencing racism in a way that is even more open, the question of how they develop collective consciousness about it happening, as it is the case now, as I see on the social media in response to last week's incident. And then, you know, this increased awareness will feed responses that can be probably not confrontation, but certainly much greater awareness and criticism of the American dream and the notion that this is a society that has no barriers. So.
That's great. We have one more question, which I'll throw in there, and I know people may have to leave, but someone else asked, what are the sources of Generation Z's values regarding inclusivity, diversity, tolerance, egalitarianism? So that seems very hopeful and promising, and I'm just wondering, I think the question is, where do they come from?
Well, I mean, the argument of the book is these agents of change, shows such as Transparent and the stand-up comics who have Netflix specials. You watch Camus Bell, for instance. It's all about demonstrating what a life organized around these values look like. Another element is, of course, sustainability. So you think of opinion leaders such as Greta Thunberg is having huge, or the social movement of students, around climate change. So I think it's many, many manifestations that are adding to each other. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I can see there's a lot of other questions that people would like to have, but unfortunately, I think we're going to have to close. But this has been really fascinating, so I really, really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. And if people want to send me their question by email, I'll be happy to respond. So this is hopefully not the end of the dialogue. And if anyone else, including the two of you, Laura and Vish, have other thoughts, please
absolutely
send them my way.
We will be in touch for sure.
Okay. Good.
I'm just going to briefly mention our next seminar for folks. We have Dr. Jennifer Prah-Ruger, who is the Emeritus Assistant Professor of Health Equity, Economics, and Policy at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice and the Perelman School of Medicine. She's a leading scholar of global and domestic health policy and public health, and she focuses on health equity to think about global and national health inequities with a particular focus on women and children. So she's going to be joining us for our next month's seminar. You can RSVP on the center's website. Also promises a really fascinating discussion. So we'd love to see you all again there, and we'll continue the conversation as we go. So thanks all for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.